Huh? Ang kanina sa table ako. You know, like labor intensive and MS. That's a bad. Sir, Ajay connect to Anil. We just let Anil once. We have sent him. If he doesn't do it, contact you. Check the online. Check online. All right. So I just announced the he's coming for that. He's coming for that. Good morning, friends and colleagues. Welcome to the last plenary session of our conference on fostering labor-intensive sectors and MSMEs for industrial transformation. I request the chair and the speakers to join us on the dais. I extend a warm welcome to the chair, Professor TCA Anand, former chief statistician with the Government of India and a distinguished visiting professor at our institute. Joining us as panelists today is Professor Ravi Srivastava, former professor at the Center for Studies in Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and director at the Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development. Also, I invite Mr. Sanjay Kumar, former partner with Deloitte India and formerly with the Indian Revenue Services. Joining us online today is Mr. Anil Bhardwaj, Secretary General, FISME, Federation of Indian Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises. We look forward to an insightful discussion in this last session. Over to you, Chair.
Now it's working. Well, good morning, everybody. And let me begin by thanking ISID and Dr. Nagesh Kumar for inviting me and organizing this session. This roundtable, this discussion is on fostering labor-intensive sectors and MSME. It's very interesting that this is the last one because through the conference, in each one of the panels, there's been substantive discussion across on problems facing both labor-intensive industry and MSMEs in different forms. So in that sense, this panel will pull together many of the thoughts which have already been expressed in the earlier sessions as well. I will, not take too much time now, but I'll come back again later. But I'll use a few minutes to sort of lay some issues upfront for all our panelists to think about when they're talking, giving their open remarks. First thing which you should know, that there is a tendency to conflate MSMEs with labor-intensive sectors. The two are important in themselves, but is it necessary to conflate them? I mean, does, for example, it mean that MSMEs are inherently labor-intensive? And the answer is no. It's not that MSMEs are inherently labor-intensive, but there is something there which makes people make this connection and draws this attention, because in general, there tends to be much of India's manufacturing employment comes from smaller enterprises. If you factor in one other element which is there in a recent working paper which Arvind Subramaniam and others co-authored coming out of MIDS, which pointed out that even in enterprises with a lot of employment, the employment is actually fragmented across multiple plants. And they've analyzed ASI data to look at this phenomenon of multi-plant enterprises. So the puzzle which remains and was flagged both yesterday and day before in number of the panels was what are the handicaps for large employment establishments in India? And even compared to our immediate neighbor, which Arvind Subramaniam brings out, for example, the area where we used to have earlier a dominant position in textiles and where large employment establishments are possible and desirable, India seems to be instead focusing on establishments which have much smaller sizes. So when we talk about fostering labor intensive sectors, there's a worth question. What is it that handicaps large establishments? I'm distinguishing between large establishments and large enterprises, because it is really the key issue is whether can we get scale benefits, which will happen only if we have large establishments. Scale benefits do not happen with large enterprises with multiple plants. So that's one class of issues. The second class of issues is with regard to MSMEs. Government and various people talk about the need to promote MSMEs, but something which we don't seem to appreciate enough is there seem to be an implicit hurdle to growth. And I was told this informally by people who have looked at even GST returns that in GST there is a threshold of filing returns, I think at 75 lakhs or something like that, and or 2 crores. Some of them are 1 crore, some are 75 lakhs. But this threshold effect operates to keep enterprises preferring to stay below that threshold. We saw that threshold effect operating also with employment sizes with ASI data and the economic census data. A similar threshold effect seems to operate on turnover, where enterprises are reluctant to cross the threshold because it means A, they lose the benefit of being small, and so all the government incentives which are present, and B, they take on the entire burden, if you like, of the inefficiencies which are there in the governance network through when you cross the threshold. So we need to promote MSMEs, but we also need to ensure that these types of threshold limit restrictions which prevent them from growing are also examined. So when we talk about fostering MSMEs, it's not a competent thing that MSMEs against large enterprises. Actually, the intention should be that the MSMEs should grow, start small and become big. The best example of this is what happened with China. China encouraged a lot of enterprises. They initially started off small. Many of the EV entities which you are seeing today started small and are now global players and in fact have huge scales. So we need to figure that out and try to develop answers to this. I will come back to these points maybe at the end when having listened to other people's presentations and comments. So the order in which I'll take them is the way they are listed in my sheet. I'll start with Professor Ravi Srivastava. He is currently Director for Center for Employment Studies at the Institute of Human Development, but was for a long time a professor at JNU and has worked extensively on matters pertaining to employment and therefore will have some key observations to make on both these topics about what are the policy challenges ahead in fostering labor-intensive manufacturing and MSMEs. Ravi.
Thanks, Anant. I hope I can be heard. Uh, Thank you, Nagesh, for inviting me to the seminar. I heard your presentation on the report yesterday, and I look forward to reading it because it seems to be a very, very extensive report, a very timely report. Uh, it covers a whole gamut of issues. So also this seminar, I was not able to listen to many of the participants, but I hope to be able to catch up, when the proceedings are published and so on. Uh, Let me just describe my entry point in this issue. I have a bias, or let's say uh, there are two entry points at which I tend to look at this debate. One is because of my long-standing experience as a member of the National Commission for Enterprises in the unorganized sector. We looked at informal enterprises very closely, focused on micro and small enterprises in many of the reports that we did. So I have the habit of looking at industry generally and the economy, and the industry in particular, and the economy generally from a bottoms-up perspective, from looking at it from a perspective which begins from much smaller enterprises, micro enterprises, if you please. The second, of course, is my bias towards looking at employment and employment generation, the generation of decent work. And that has been a focus of much of what I have done in the last few years. So these two are broadly the kind of perspectives that I come in with. The third issue is something which I will, counterpose to the remark that Anant made. Anant's view of the world is that, small enterprises should go large, take advantages of scale, which of course is a very important perspective. But I think in the post-Fordist world, and with the kind of changes that we have seen globally in the last 15 to 20 years with ICT and so on, we've moved a great deal towards different description of scale, different description of how scale is incorporated in industrial governance, through outsourcing and so on. So big is not necessarily the same as it used to be 30 or 40 years ago. And also, in terms of the kind of discussions that we've been having also in this seminar on the question of green transition, green technologies, and so on, there is a great deal of focus now also on the local economy. So the word local, which also comes in quite frequently, is a very important. I think it's a very important way of looking at economic processes. The local economy, and Ela Bhatt called it in her book, in a book which I think most of us as economists should also read, The 100-Mile Economy, is an important counterweight to building not only building a greener economy through smaller enterprises which serve the local economy, which produce for the local economy. They're not, I mean, these terms are not being used exclusively. I'm not saying that you completely counterpose the local economy to the national or the global economy, but I'm saying that we need to provide space for the local economy. And therefore, there is also space for small enterprises, micro enterprises, which are producing locally, producing for final demand locally, using raw materials and a whole range. And I think there's a great deal of scope for that. So I would not necessarily be completely swayed by the argument that, big is beautiful and that, all economy. But I think the important issue here is that in the process of industrial transformation, we need to aim at raising productivity of small enterprises or micro enterprises, and also nurture them so that they're able to provide decent work, they're able to grow. Growing is not it doesn't become a constraint either because of one set of policies that you, for example, the threshold effect that you pointed out, or another set of policies. So yes, growth and growth in productivity remains extremely important. at all levels, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of, in my worldview, lead to very large enterprises. What I would think is that, basically in the context of the discussion today, um, I would look at three main tendencies in the economy going back to the post-liberalization period. But I think these tendencies have accentuated in the recent past. And number one, is the broad tendency towards increasing capital intensity of manufacturing in India. Uh, the CLEM data, for which Professor Goldar and others have contributed, shows that quite clearly. And there are multiple reasons why capital intensity has been increasing in Indian manufacturing. We can go into that. The second is the labor-intensive sectors in India uh, have not done as well as they could have. We have not been able to. The reason why manufacturing has not been able to make a dent as far as employment is concerned, employment structure is concerned, is primarily because the labor-intensive structure in sectors have not done well. Apparel wear is, of course, a primary example where India has barely been able to hold on to its share in the global markets, whereas smaller countries such as Bangladesh and Vietnam and now even perhaps Turkey, have either overtaken us or are prepared to overtake us. So we have not been able to build up the advantage that we had in labor-intensive sectors. The third is that uh, the small and micro sector, and I'm going to make a distinction here between there's a large overlap between the terminology that I'm used to using, which is the informal sector, and the small and micro sector. But the MSME sector, to me, is a bit of an anachronism, and I'll come to that a little later. But the third is the environment which has confronted the small and micro sector since liberalization. And the reason why, of course, these three trends are quite interrelated. The fact that there has been an increasing capital intensity of production in the Indian economy, policies obviously have contributed to this. The fact that labor-intensive sectors have not been able to make the kind of breakthrough that they were supposed to break through, and the kind of environment that has faced the micro and small enterprises. These are very closely related. And although I agree with your statement that in this case the MSME sector doesn't necessarily always cannot be equated with labor-intensive sectors, but of course there is a very large overlap. There is a very large overlap between labor-intensive sectors and the MSME sector, particularly the SME sector. So that overlap also cannot be ignored. That is why the performance of these sectors is of great importance to us. In fact, what you see is that over the more recent period, all these three trends have actually accentuated, they've exacerbated. Capital intensity of manufacturing has increased a lot. We don't, unfortunately, have the kind of studies which were done by the founder of this institute, Dr. S.K. Goel, in recent years, in studies on industrial concentration and so on. But perhaps they would show a greater degree of industrial concentration that exists today than existed in the past in many industries, in many sectors, if these studies were to be carried out. We also find that labor-intensive sectors have been flagging in the last few years. And you look at leather and leather exports, gems and jewelry, apparel wear, and so on. These are sectors where exports have been flagging. They have not been doing well. So the trend which was there earlier seems to have been accentuated. Again, in particular, because of the kind of policies, mainly because of recent policies, the informal sector or the SME sector has been doing quite badly. If you look, Mr. Mohanan's recent work on employment, where, for example, he compares the 15-16 unorganized enterprises survey, in unincorporated enterprises survey with the 21-22 results shows that even by 21-22, uh, because of the series of shocks that the small and micro sector confronted in the form of demonetization, the ban on cattle trade, which took place earlier in 2016, GST, and COVID. So by 21-22, this sector had not even recovered to the levels of 2015-16. Of course, we have seen very rapid growth, and this is a point which Professor Goldar and Dr. Agarwal have made in recent papers. Have seen very rapid growth in manufacturing since 2021 over the last 3 years. In fact, now the growth of manufacturing, if you look at the growth of manufacturing since 2017-18, that which the PLFS establishes, manufacturing employment grew at the rate of 3.6%. But all of this was actually concentrated in the last 3 years because in 2021, manufacturing employment was in fact a little lower than the level of manufacturing employment that prevailed even at the low level in 2017-18. So the growth has been concentrated in the last 3 years, but this growth has been it still leaves questions to be answered. It has been fairly lopsided. Broadly, as we know, urban and rural manufacturing contribute roughly equally to employment. But what has happened in the last few years is that employment growth has been entirely rural centered. Almost 88%, 87, 88% has been female employment. 70% of this has been self-employment. Of course, it's still been spread across sectors, and only about 63% is in small enterprises and enterprises employing 0 to 9 workers. The rest of it has been in larger enterprises. So there has been a revival of manufacturing in the last 3 years, but this revival of manufacturing still leads to a lot of questions about the nature of the revival, uneven nature of revival that has taken place in manufacturing employment. So in general, the picture of the informal sector, manufacturing, the crisis which has been there due to policy shifts that in general holds, despite the kind of revival that we have seen in the last 3 years. So, these tendencies that are the three tendencies that I've talked about have been quite pervasive. Now, I think there are specific reasons which one can go into, and maybe briefly I could sort of just point out to them. As far as capital intensity is concerned, capital intensity has been driven by a lot of factors. When we were in the NCUS, we had commissioned a number of papers and studies, including by Professor Golder and others. And at that stage, and this again has been, recent studies also tell us this, that among the factors is, of course, the nature of demand, the domestic demand and external demand, technology, but also that the cost of capital. The cost of capital has been very cheap, for large enterprises and which has raised capital intensity over a period of time. So you find that policies in general, the policies and in general the drift of the economy has been steadily raising capital intensity over a period of time. When it comes to the labor-intensive sectors, we don't find the same kind of strategic thrust. For example, if you look at the last few years, we find a major strategic thrust through the PLI initiative and of course Make in India. But the PLI initiative, because of the thresholds that it has, in general tends to, of course, not all sectors are equally, I mean, some sectors are fairly labor intensive, and some sectors which have shown growth, mobiles and semiconductors, mobiles in particular, are fairly employment generating. But in general, PLI has tended to favor capital intensive sectors and very high threshold levels, therefore, larger sized, large enterprises rather than small and medium enterprises. But you don't find the same kind of thrust on labor-intensive sectors. The same kind of strategic thrust in India has never been on labor-intensive sectors. Uh, there is also, when you come look at labor-intensive sectors, see, one of the issues, and I think I need to dwell a little bit on it, is that uh, in general, policy, and this I come back to my perspective on looking at industrial structure. Policy has not been attentive to the kind of industrial structure that we have in India. The kind of industrial structure we have in India means that, even in manufacturing, even in the arena of manufacturing, two-thirds of manufacturing is in the informal sector. Uh, MSME that we talk about is a bit of a. I hope that there is something on, in the report, you do a little bit of, either in this report or in future reports, on unpackaging the terminology of the MSME that we use. Because after the MSEDs Act of 2005, 6, and then, of course, its modification in 2020, this has become a huge bucket. Uh, is it is it relevant in policy terms? In the NCUS, what we found was that we needed to continue to focus on the small and the micro. Uh, if you look at the MSME sector as a whole, uh, depending on the kind of database that you use, 98 to 99% of this sector is really micro enterprises, however it is defined. And 60 to 70% of this enterprise consists of very tiny or nano enterprises, which fall in the realm that Anant has talked about, of enterprises which have less than 20 or 25 lakhs of turnover, very little capital, which are really subsistence oriented, more subsistence oriented, enterprises. Uh, it is difficult to club these enterprises, which are truly informal sector enterprises, with large enterprises in terms of their dynamics. And yet they form 60 to 70% of total enterprises in manufacturing. So from a policy perspective, we do need to differentiate very sharply between these different segments. And one of the problems in clubbing all of them together is that the policy attention then drifts towards the upper segment of what is the MSME. I'm not saying whether this is good or bad, but what I'm saying is that leads to a lack of attention on the other segments of the MSME. And why is this important? Because if you look at the labor-intensive sectors, I'll come to the other reasons why this is important. But if you look at the labor-intensive sectors in the Indian economy, where, as I have said, we have not given enough strategic thrust in the past. And this strategic thrust involves a number of elements, including, of course, how do we build up industrial productivity, how do our firms move up the global value chains, and so on. But there is also the fact that that each of these labor-intensive sectors is, in terms of structure, is very complex, consisting of firms which are across the spectrum. If you look at, for example, if you look at apparel wear, it's a classic example where 70% of workers in the apparel wear industry are self-employed. 87% of workers in apparel wear work in enterprises which employ less than 10 workers. 87% are employed in enterprises which work in less than 10%. So how do you exactly, when you look at strategically at the apparel wear sector and building a productivity, which segment are you looking at? Are you involving the whole chain? 70% of production is for the domestic market. So this is also a very crucial issue when it comes to labor-intensive manufacturers. So I think this is one issue that I want to flag, when the strategic thrust, and within it looking at the entire manufacturing structure, so to say. The second issue is, again, coming back to the micro and small enterprise sector, is that, and this is something which I think we all understand, is that it is an extremely heterogeneous sector. Very heterogeneous in terms of size, in terms of market orientation, in terms of contracting relationships, in terms of its position in value chains, whether there is participation or non-participation in value chains, technology, and so on and forth. So obviously for this sector, uh, one size fit all cannot be a strategy. We need a very, very varied strategy, but we need a very focused strategy. And we need this strategy, of course, at various levels, from the local and state level to the national level. There will be some areas where we would like industry units to be inserted in the global value chains. Yeah, we would like to work on that. Clusters would be another strategy. So there would be multiple strategies. The issue of finance is there. We had proposed a bank for the unorganized sector. Ultimately, we came up with the refinance facility. Mudra is a bit close to that. So essentially, I think these three areas, if you're thinking of labor-intensive industrialization, the three areas that I've tried to point out to, one is how do we look at the overall increasing capital intensity of manufacturing? B, how do we develop a holistic focus on labor-intensive sectors in a strategic thrust? Thirdly, how do we bring back the focus on the micro and small industry, which basically during liberalization were, in the name of creating a leveling ground, they were actually discriminating against. And today also the situation is there is no level playing ground as far as micro and small enterprises are concerned. How do we deal with this situation? I think these are three important issues if you want to think of industrial transformation.
Thank you, Ravi. Professor Srivastava has flagged a number of important issues which confront both labor-intensive and MSMEs in different forms. I will now request Mr. Anil Bhardwaj. I believe he's online. Okay, Mr. Bhardwaj, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Good. May I request you to make your presentation? You can also similarly take about 10 to 15 minutes. 15 minutes is what Ravi took, so maybe I'll be equal with everybody. So 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for this opportunity. I think the topic is extremely important, and I think important points have also been touched already. As you know that some of the important sectors in the MSME segment, which are labor intensive, includes textiles and apparels, leather, food processing, gems and jewelry, light engineering, and we take the term little expansively, then light engineering would also include items of plastics, rubber, and chemicals which are used in different processes and products of light engineering, including auto and others. And one interesting observation that I would like to posit before you is that there is an inherent reason why that in spite of a lot of government efforts, these labor-intensive sectors have not been able to live up to the expectations in terms of their ability to scale up, in their ability to create more jobs, and especially to become more competitive and resilient. I think one of the important reasons is that, all of these sectors have been reserved traditionally in India for 40, 50 years. And people of my age and who are senior to me would recall that, there has been a very powerful reservation policy in India for the small scale industries, a predecessor of MSME as is used to be called. And up till 1995, reservation policies continued, although some reservation started after 1991 industrial policy, but that was only, you can say, very peripheral. But after 1995, it was clear that quantitative restrictions would ultimately go, and the US took us to the court. And after a long battle, India lost the case in WTO, and quantitative restrictions were removed completely. QRs were removed completely. And most of these QRs were related to small scale industries, and particularly these labor intensive sectors. So what happened actually during the process when the debate was going on, SSIs were given to understand that, no matter what comes, the reservation policy will continue and they will continue to live and prosper in a protected environment. All the world had changed. And FISME was perhaps the lone organization that tried to convince the policymakers at the time that once you have signed on WTO and you agree to remove quantity restrictions, free of imports, and if free imports are allowed, there is no point keeping the policy of reservation in India. It would be like, you don't allow Indian company to grow and become medium enterprise or large enterprise, or a large enterprises to get into those sectors which were reserved, but imports were allowed freely from the largest of the companies in the world. And it definitely had its impact, and slowly and steadily all these sectors have been displaced, and we had seen that imports taking place massively, especially from China from 2005 onwards. This is one important reason, apart from other things. We usually have other constraints, as you know, two things. One is economy of scale. And in economy of scale, there have been two major constraints. One remains, and that continues to be, on the labor laws. And as you know, currently, if you look at the data, we say that 64 million enterprises and 110 people employed, which translates to approximately 2 persons a unit. And if you look at the other piece of data, which is the organized sector, that is annual survey of industries, so we have 2.5 lakh industries only out of the 64 million enterprises, or 6.4 crore enterprises. Barely 2.5 lakh are companies or manufacturers that are employing more than 10 people. So you can appreciate that, in India, the scale of manufacturing enterprises is ridiculously low. It is very, very small. It is micro or tiny by global standards. Even garment companies, if you look at our neighboring countries, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, they are 100 times or more larger than the Indian companies, except quite a few. You can count them on finger Shai exports and Rajesh exports and so on. But otherwise, they are very, very small. And one of the chief reasons is, of course, the very high cost of social security, which comes out approximately 30 to 35% on the wages. And the difficulty is that, as laws have not been, updated, and the court system continues to be what it is, where, the disputes are almost never settled for 20, 30 years. So people continue to either remain below the 10 employee mark, or they go for contracting out. So companies like the bigger of the companies in garment sector have opted, or they are surviving. Not only in garment sector, as a matter of fact, almost all of Indian manufacturing, you would see, from whether it is the automobile companies or others, they are now surviving on contracting out. Now, the problem is contracting out is, of course, you would be able to reduce the cost of compliance to some extent, and also you'd have flexibility in hiring and firing. But the flip side is that you'd have to compromise on quality, because you would not be investing in the people because they are not your employee. They are employee of the contractor, and there is very high turnout of such employees. So that's why most of the global value chains have skirted out India. I mean, they are not really, making Indian manufacturers as part of their global plans, except those which have large employee base or have achieved a scale. The second problem is, as rightly said, I think my predecessor has said during this conference, the increased capital intensity. Not only because of the concerns of carbon intensity, or you can say greening of processes and so on and so forth, but basically, in order to achieve economy of scale, We need larger plants, more efficient plants, and those are expensive. And this is one major difficulty, or the area of greater difficulty for the MSMEs: access to external equity, whether it is private equity or it is equity through the IPO route. It's only very recently that we have now SME exchanges, and some of the companies, even in the gems and jewelry or textile garment sector, has started going through the route. But the number is very, very small, and you can count them on fingers. Most of the companies that have still taken advantage are in other areas rather than in labor-intensive sectors. So external equity, labor, and of course, third is the technology, access to technology. So, and they are interrelated. I mean, if you find it difficult to raise capital, if you find it difficult to scale up, your size remains so minuscule that no foreign company is interested in forming a joint venture with a tiny enterprise where he sees that, after exposing itself to a foreign market, you are going to get very small part of the total Indian market that it has. So, I mean, put together, it becomes quite challenging for manufacturing sector, particularly in the labor-intensive sector, to stay competitive because of these factors. And another factor is particularly for MSMEs, is that in India, although Indian markets have become competitive, imports are relatively free, but if you look at the raw material market, whether it is plastic raw material like polymers, which would have impact on man-made fiber. So man-made fiber, it would be, you have to brace for large number of, first of all, very high duties on it. And then you'd have anti-dumping duties, safeguard duties. Similar is the case with iron and steel. So is the case with aluminum. So is the case with copper. So if you look at these 4 or 5 raw materials, which form the building blocks of industrial economy, in India, the functional competitive market is not there for MSMEs. And because of that, whatever they produce, it becomes uncompetitive in majority of the cases, and they find it very difficult to compete from the imports, and also they find it difficult to exports. I mean, in theory, if you are exporting, then you can have duty-free raw material. But the problem of MSMEs is that their scale is very small. So imagine like a cycle part manufacturer in Ludhiana, and it wants to import, it requires a specific type of steel, and the steel is from Korea, is to come from Korea, and it wants one container of that steel. Now, nobody from Korea, the POSCO and others, I mean, are going to quote for one container of steel. So even if theoretically it is possible to import raw materials for exports and at international prices, it is not practical. And if you look at it pragmatically, then you have to buy raw material from the domestic market, which has the markups of, as I said, high import duties, and in most of the cases, anti-dumping duties, and in many cases, safeguard duties. The cumulative impact of these 3 set of duties is that raw material prices in India are at least 15 to 30% higher than the international prices. And in such a scenario, it becomes very challenging for the MSME sector, particularly in the labor-intensive sector, where the margins are very thin, and you are only playing on the labor arbitrage of say 5%, 10%. And if you are made uncompetitive by 15-20% because of the raw material cost, there is very little chance that you can stay competitive. And that is why the competing economies, whether it is Vietnam, whether it is Thailand, Malaysia, etc., they have been able to take advantage of joining the global value chains. And most of the global value chains, particularly in these sectors, have not really invested much in India. And in spite of the PLI schemes, we see very little headway so far as the MSME space is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bhartwaj. You were very efficient in time management and made your communicated a point very clearly. So I'll turn to Mr. Sanjay Kumar and same requirements. Do you need this?
I need your.
Yeah.
Right. Uh, Thank you, Chair. And thanks to Nagesh for inviting me. I sent him a message on LinkedIn long ago. He didn't see that, but fortunately for me, to read that message recently and then invited me. So thanks a lot to Nagesh for inviting me. Happy to be here. Many of the things have been talked about. I come from a background which just not does point out the problems. I come from a background which finds a solution. I was in the government, then I was in the consulting firm. So let me talk about what I have, which is take some of the points which the former speakers have spoken about, but let me expand on that, because the problem of the MSME is not only a particular sector. It is spread across all the sectors. It's not that the motor cars or automobile sector does not have an MSME sector. It has. The question is how best we harness them. How do we bring something which Sweden did at one point of time? I mean, Alfred Nobel was actually running an MSME enterprise. How did China do when it started in 1991 and brought it to this level that they are the producers of the world? So let me point that out. I'll also bring a little bit of perspective on the exports while starting with what the MSME sector is. And I think it's quite well known that the GVA contribution of MSME has actually gone down from 30.5% in 2019-20 to now almost like 29.5 or something like that. I hope it goes up in the near future. The problem is also that we have 90% of the manufacturing in the MSME, and large number of services sector also are in the MSME sector. So let's talk about both, but I'll concentrate on the manufacturing. The employment is to the extent of about 70% in the MSME sector. World over, it is about 50%. So the labor intensity on that comparison is not very much skewed. It is there, but then but the question is that even to bridge that gap of 15-20%, it will take something to do. At some point of time, when we were during the COVID, we were working with the government, and we looked at 6 sectors. One of them was textiles, pharmaceuticals, food processing, and many others. One of the things that we felt was very, very important, and it has worked in India in the past, and when I say so, my mind is on the automobile sector, which had this angel investor, and then you had the cluster of MSME enterprises. Let's take the case of Maruti. How did they do that? They have Maruti Enterprises, and then they have a whole lot of enterprises which started with the bracket of being in the MSME sector, but today many of them are listed companies. So the question is, and same thing is in textiles. You have textiles all over, but then we are not very effective in converting our textiles into ready-made garments, and why we are not giving competition to the other countries. And I just jotted down some of our share and where we think we'll be there. I looked at the textile apparel sector. At present, in 2021, it was 4% of the global share in the global trade. And if we did our own projection by 2017, it should be about 15% of the global share, which is not a small one. right? And that's also attracted, PLI of 10.6 in 1,000 crores. And then food processing, presently 3%, and global share by 2017 is going to be about 7%. Electronics, which is still starting, had a share of about 0.5, and now by 2017 it will be about 5%. That's our thinking. And pharma 3.5, and then 5%. And all these have got the PLI. So when we look at the clusters, it allows you to go for the synergy. It goes for the scale. I think Professor Ravi Srivastava talked about the scale. And more important, about the product development. Many of the MSME are unable to produce a product which is competitive, which has the customer's interface, which is liked by the customers. So, and that also, when I say that, it also talks about the NTBs. Yesterday in the conference, people talked about the NTBs. So the product development is part of that. The third one, finance, which is a common problem, and then the technology, which is a huge problem. And product development and technology, they are connected to each other, because if you don't have technology, you don't have the cluster approach, the angel and the people around that, and the parks, be it textile parks or be it food processing parks, which are the labor intensive ones, will be able to do, and also I would include in that pharma for the time being, because all these will be able to do far better. Because when we look at these sectors, why our textiles is not doing well? Because either our manufacturing is not good. Because when we looked at what is being exported and what is our recovery rate, we happen to be better than many others, including our neighbor Bangladesh. Today is in complete disarray, but forget that and talk about the yesteryears of Bangladesh. We had a far better recovery rate on our exports. The question is, how do we scale it up? How do we bring it to the fore that we become a good exporting nation? And large number of MSME producing textiles, producing apparels, producing our ready-made garments are enabled to do. Take for example a very simple one, button and the thread. Many of the threads and the buttons, if you're not using as per the international specifications, as per the buyers are not going to buy. You will fail the technical specifications of the buyers. And that is a very, very important thing. So when we are talking to the UP government, particularly on the ODOP is everywhere. ODOP is in Andhra Pradesh, ODOP is in Madhya Pradesh, ODOP is in UP, and many other places. How do we scale it up? It's not that the others are not manufacturing. The question is, how do we bring them together? How do we increase the scale? How do we provide the technology? How do we provide them the finance? And how do we bring far more synergy? Because it's not about one person going ahead of the other. It's about the whole community going ahead together. Then only you will see a better MSME, the example that I talked about of Sweden and China. Did that. And it's a time for us to start thinking in a particular manner how best we do. Of course, I have not seen a real studies on the automobile sector and the cluster approach and how it is improving the exports, etc. But it does bring a lot more synergy as far as we understood talking to the industry and talking to the policymakers, and we got this essence. That's one point. Let me also bring this another aspect that we did that, and this is a study that we did for the Niti Aayog, which is now going rounds of the government. They asked for what are the areas that we should be really promoting from an export point of view. So we broke this entire perspective into 4 quadrants. One was the growth masters, where we have good, we have a consistent strength being an exporter, and we have good potential to be exporting. That means you are able to supply to that extent. First, I talked about how do we improve the supply. It's not about the big industries only doing that. It's also about the MSMEs doing that, and how do we take it forward. That was the first part. Now I'm talking on the trade part. So that was the growth masters. The second one that we looked at, the growth opportunities, where there was a strong growth, but potential to do is also there, and we have not yet achieved the right hand foremost, the top corners of the right hand, which is this, which is the top corner. This is the second one. The third one is where we say that we have established market, but we are not able to fulfill our potential, and then the ones which are totally laggards. Okay. We did about 60, 18, 20 countries based on our countries of significance, the ones where we have large exports. USA is the one, and then there comes UAE, the third one is Netherlands, and then the rest. Talking about the MSME sector, few of them that I would want to mention, which have a good growth. They are in the top right corner of the trade quadrant. The ones which are food processing, and in that the shrimps and the fish, because at the moment what we are doing, we send it to Japan for clean it up, or to Thailand to clean it up, and then it moves to US. But this is where still we are exporting to a large extent, but we can increase that. And that's a huge area. Government has taken some effort on that, and talking about the coastal fishermen, but the processing facility is still in WIP, and that is something which will be important. So one is the fishery. The second one was the non-knit women suits. Now these are again textiles and apparels. Then the third one, knit shirts for the t-shirts for the men. Then we also looked at the leather footwear, and this is for the US. I'm not talking about the big industries. I'm talking about the MSME industry. So we have, and the second one is among the engineering goods called transmission. Those are the transmission equipments used for the manufacturing purposes, and these are in the top right corner of the US. Now, question is, have we looked at this carefully? Once identified the sector, what is happening on many of these things? Government in November 2021 came out with a circular talking about Aspire, right? And there they had talked about the two sectors. One was the food processing, and the other one was the tourism. The food processing sector in July 2020, they came out with the financing to the top sectors, the high end of the industry. The second one was the medium industries, and the third one was at the farm gate. These are about the food processing sector. Many of these will qualify there, and they can be there. But I'm not really sure what happened on the ground, because the money was to flow through the bank, and there the financing became a major issue. Because the risk assessment, they must pass the risk assessment test of the banks, and the banks will not give them the money. So that became a major issue. But I hope something like this happens, because the government is keen to give the money at the farm level, and also at the district level, and then at the tertiary level. So all these, the three sectors have been identified. The growth opportunities, which is the lower right corner of the quadrant. The last one is the total laggards. I'm not going to talk about that, because there you find cars and other things, because India produces the cars which are not even get any look in by the US, largely because of the reasons that our cars are small. Our cars do not pass the muster of the US because they have their own specifications, etc. So leave that aside for the time being. the growth opportunities that we have is the valves and air pumps. Now, this is again an area where the MSME are doing quite well. They have a strong presence. The question is how we identify them and think of it to take them to the next corner, the top right corner. Other opportunity areas that we thought are toys, where we have started doing something. Some PLIs are coming, and I don't see that much GVA or allocation of funds have happened to these toy manufacturers as yet. One of the risks that we found is with the air pumps because of the technical specifications, and that's why while the opportunities are there, they can easily move into the top right corner of the matrix. But we found that the air pumps have certain amount of risk as it is looming on. The second one which I would want to mention here is again UK. Another area which we know very well. I've not talked about the other ones, but I'm talking about the UK, where we are likely to do FTAs with. The top right corner, where the growth masters corner, is air pumps. Now, again, air pump earlier, air pump now. Now, again, there are a lot of MSME presence. Then, and the established markets were, for UK, is the leather footwear. That means they have a very good chance to establish themselves and occupy a large export segment in UK. Okay, they have easy things to do. And the other one is the knit T-shirts. So these are some of the points that I thought I should bring in. Now, question is, it's not that we can look at all the MSME sectors by one brush, because it's too large and too, difficult. And the finances and the technology and the attention will be limited, because if we just put it equally divide on other. The question is, how do we look at some of these sectors and pay a larger attention to them so that we occupy a larger trade exporters. And once they do that, it will always be very good in the Indian industry. Because once I looked at many of these air pumps are also used in the automobiles, I was aghast to find that there is not a single patent in the automobile component side. Now, we are trying to be one of the leading automobile exporters and producers, and our automobile components do not have, and this is not my study, this is what the FICCI says, that we do not have a single patent. And if you do not produce you do not put in your money on the R&D, you do not produce, either collaboratively or by yourself, then the chance that you will be an OEM, original equipment manufacturer, very low. It may not happen. On the fringe and never occupy the center space. So our ambition and our attention has to be such that where we have a good comparative advantage, where we are establishing ourselves very well, let us put our attention to that and occupy that space. So MSME as such is a big one. As I said, 90% of our business, the numbers is occupied by the MSME sector. And I think Mr. Anil Bhardwaj talked about that definition has to be revisited because not everyone needs that attention. But then the attention, if we at all have to give, let us bring them into a cluster. Think of how do we bring that to scale? How do we provide finance? How do we give them the technology? And it's not that the government has to do that. It is the private sector. If they find them useful, they will always look at that. These were some of my points, Chairman. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So, thanks, Sanjay. We have done well on time. We are in good shape. Before I open the floor for comments and questions, for the way I'm going to do it is I'll make some observations just on what people said, and I'll invite comments, suggestions, queries from the floor, and go back to my panelists to respond to them, and then we can wind up. Each one of our panelists spoke on different facets of the challenge which confronts MSMEs and labor intensive sectors. I think let me start by flagging some of the things which Ravi had said. I think we've spent far too much time trying to define on what is desirable. In some sense, this notion that large enterprises are not desirable is a concept which we need to abandon. Insofar as scale is concerned, it is possible that optimal scale may be small, and it is possible that optimal scale can be large. If for production purposes optimal scale is small, large enterprises will also reap the benefit of that, and in effect they can do it through making sure that their plant sizes are kept at the level where scale is optimal. The question which happens is, why is it that where internationally it is seen that the optimal production scale is large, for example in garment manufacture, the benefits to for example exporting, when you have large production facilities which can meet the demand of a single large buyer, we simply don't have them compared to what has been achieved in all over Southeast Asia, Bangladesh and others. It's important to ask, why is that not happening? And there are many answers hidden in it. People tend to focus on labor laws. I think they tend to overstate the role played by labor law. There are many other local regulations, land availability. Long ago in 2000 or 2001, McKinsey had done a report which had attracted a lot of interest, which said the major problem in India manufacturing growth is going to be land, not labor. In fact, they were very clear that the focus should not be labor. Our land rules, land availability, the manner in which land gets available to manufacturing. In fact, on day, I think it was on day one in the panel, the problems which enterprises face in getting land availability, and I think the story which was given, I forget by whom, when he talked about RICO and how the cumbersome process of approvals to get land to set up a manufacturing establishment continues to be one of the major hurdles. And in India, the challenges for manufacturing as a whole, and certainly MSMEs face this problem much more, because their ability to negotiate the complex hurdles which are posed by the governance system remain huge. And it sometimes, this was pointed out long back in the 60s, when the Hazari Committee had given its report on the licensing Raj, that the licensing Raj creates a set of hurdles which only the large industry with their capacity to create efficient liaison offices in Delhi are able to negotiate. And in fact, what has happened is, in the name of promoting MSMEs and in the aim of promoting labor intensive sectors, we create a set of bureaucratic hurdles which actually have a perverse effect. So that's one class of effects which we need to talk about, and it's some things which we need to think through. A second point I'd like to point to is an observation made about capital intensity. Capital intensity is driven by two types of drivers. One set of drivers is global. The way technological change has taken place and the manner of development of new technology, partly because of the needs of Europe and North America, as the more modern machineries which are coming up inherently use less labor. Now that's fine for them because they have very expensive labor. But in order to produce the same quality product, we are also obliged to make use of the same machinery. As a consequence, capital intensity into large measure is driven by the imperatives of change which are being driven by the developed world. That is one side of capital intensity. But the other side of capital intensity is the fact that there is a reluctance for us to go in for large establishments. And because there are costs to having high employment, so you try to outsource production, not outsource labor. That's one problem. Where you get contractual staff, that's one problem. But where production itself is outsourced and you sort of gather in the products from a vast number of small suppliers and simply put your label on it, is a challenge and a problem specific to India. The third part of the low cost of capital is very peculiar. Companies are reluctant to use institutional finance. There was a report which I saw yesterday or today in the newspapers. There was a story somewhere which said that working capital finance of large companies largely comes from suppliers. They are reluctant to take institutional finance for working capital, but instead rely on supplier finance. And the point which the article was making is that this actually puts a huge burden on the supplier industries, which are often MSMEs. Many of them buy spare parts, equipment, and so on and so forth from their suppliers, which are located in the MSME sector. And the supplier is expected to extend working capital credit to the large manufacturer. Now, this facet of why is it that you are reluctant to take institutional finance and instead rely on supplier finance? This is true in jewelry, this is true in automobiles, and this is true in a vast number of sectors, is something which we need to take a look at. The second and a third element, which is I do want to underline and emphasize, is the very perverse protectionist regime which we seem to follow. And I think Anil Bhardwaj brought this out very clearly with the manner in which we levy duties and protection on inputs. So we often end up creating a distorted regime where key inputs which are needed in the MSME sector are protected off. हेलो इसमें आ गया. Okay, sorry, let me use this. So the range of challenges which confront the MSME sector is complex and quite faceted. Some of it are common to manufacturing as a whole. It's not limited to MSMEs. Some of it is specific to MSMEs. And I'll add one last because it's been a bugbear of mine for a while. We talk about the fact that there was a slowdown in manufacturing which took place. People tend to point out as the period between 2016 and 21 as the slowdown. Actually, if you were to compare the data from 2010 to 2021, you would get a similar slowdown. What is it that happened in the period between 10 and 22 which led to this major slowdown in manufacturing? There are many factors which happened. There is the global dimension, which have brought out in various presentations in this conference. But one dimension which has not been picked up is that during this period, India was running one of the highest cost of capital to industry from the viewpoint of the lending rates which banks were charging. Our interest cost, real interest cost in this entire period was among the highest in the world. if you were to calculate real interest cost to manufacturing by taking the nominal interest rate and deflating it by the effective price received by manufacturing, not overall price index, but the price of manufacturing, then you would find that the real interest in India was much higher than that of any country in the world. We maintained this high interest regime much longer than was necessary, well after inflation rates had come down. And in any case, manufacturing in this entire period saw disinflation. So the combined effect on manufacturing was that capital cost, in addition to all the other problems, was also being high. So it's natural that manufacturing saw a slowdown. And the impact of manufacturing slowdown would have been on all segments of manufacturing, including the micro segments. So pinning down one or two policy changes and say this is what caused the decline in manufacturing may be problematic. There was a whole sort of perfect storm of policy measures which came together in this period between 2010 and 2020, which has gone against manufacturing. If we wish to revive manufacturing, we will need to sort of relook at all these components. Some are not going to change. We are not going to get a benevolent global environment. The technology challenges will also be not necessarily in our favor. The things which are possible for us to handle are domestic policy, interest costs, and the manner in which we manage both land and labor laws. I'll restrict my comments here and turn to the floor. There are many people who have much greater knowledge of these issues. I'm sure some of them will have additional points or suggestions to add. We have a question at the back. Please introduce yourself and your institution and then go ahead.
Yes, I'm Manish Sharma. I'm working with Forrester Research. My basic question is that, we are finding that government started, this ONDC is open network for, digital commerce kind of platform to take on, Amazon and these big tech, because they were marketing quite aggressively, at very low cost, because they had these warehouses, fulfillment centers, their logistics, which was far more efficient, and they had also, private equity investment also from Sequoia, etc. These PE firms which could, absorb losses, So what was happened to this ONDC scheme? How ONDC platform, how much successful it was, because it was meant to onboard all these MSMEs, who can basically, because they couldn't, because they were not able to individually, manufacture all these displays, processors, etc. Same as the value addition was quite low, so that was to motivate that only, so that they will be able to gain market access, etc. So what happened to that? Yeah, so thanks very much.
Good. That's a very good point. We'll come back. Yeah. Nitya, can somebody get you a mic? Sitting right.
Thank you. Very interesting discourse. I have just two small questions. One first is to Mr. Sanjay Kumar. That recovery rate in India of textile export is higher than Bangladesh. Does it have something to do with who exactly is exporting? Bangladesh has done wonder in garment export. But if I ask you, give me one Bangladeshi garment brand, you will be struggling to find out a name. If I tell you, give me a few Indian brands, you will be able to tell. They may not be globally very reputed, but they have some reputation, at least in India, and maybe in some other places. Now, when you talk about exporting and talking about large buyers of US and Europe, it might be a short-term strategy to export, but what happens in that? The Bangladeshi women who work, they get very little. The SMEs of Bangladesh who operate at a wafer thin margin, and the large chunk of the benefit goes to those big brands. Now Bangladesh would be struggling, after that, how to, get out of that, trap they get into. Now, as a large country and with some long history of textile and garment industry, should we have short, medium, long-term strategies that would be different or same? Should we be happy with what Bangladesh is doing and we replicate that? Or should we have that we can create our own brands who maybe after 20 years would compete with the Gucci's of the world, so large French, Italian, American brands. So, I would say, our long-term strategies should be for that, not just, getting a few $1 million of export here and there, but long-term strategy has to be, like that. China is trying to do that, and Korea was not really able to do that, so they're out of garment business now. So, and in India, we should not, given our size, we should not be out of garment business probably at any point of time. But to get maximum out of it, we have to think of our own marketing, and that's where production and marketing, production, there can be one optimum level where production cost is lowest. If you go up, production cost might go up. But the moment you talk about marketing, where the actual money is coming from, the bigger, the merrier, the marketing advantage you get if you are bigger company or bigger brand. But maybe from chairman also and Professor Srivastava. What would be our strategy in the long term? Thank you.
Okay, there's a gentleman behind.
Thank you, panelists, for such a wonderful session. My name is Hariom and I am from IIT Indore. So, given the notion of structural change, whereby there is a tendency to move up in the hierarchy from low skilled to high skilled, so how to deal with the problem of skilling as well as reskilling, and whether whether the workforce is ready to move to to blue collar jobs, so whether they wanted to be a part of blue collar jobs or not. So that's a
Okay. Oh, let's do one thing. Should we? Okay, we'll take two more and then so this gentleman, then I'll take a. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we are missing a point here about the MSME transformation. This time period which you have mentioned between 2010 and 22, during this period, in 2005 and 6, we had reduced the tariffs from an average of 24% to 6%. So that is a very big issue, because if you are making the imports cheaper by such a significant amount, so definitely the decline of manufacturing was to be there, and it happened. Second point I wanted to make here is that about the labor and the land reforms. These are two very much hyped topics, and in these conferences we must raise this issue, that labor reforms and so-called labor reforms and the land reforms, in fact, we have to rethink about these things. Otherwise, reforms means hire and fire, and land reform means taking over the land of anybody without any consents. So these two issues have to be deliberated upon, that what kind of labor reforms we are asking for and what kind of land reforms we are asking for. For example, there is no dearth of land available which is waste and which is not being used, held as land banks with the big corporates, including the public sector. So that can very, very easily be used. And in one of the meetings, we had in fact asked for imposing, in which you were also there, Professor, that we had asked for imposing the vacant land tax. And I think the government is, to some extent, is going ahead with that. So if we can do these kinds of reforms, I think that will be a better idea. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Let allow some people. Yes, go ahead.
Shall I go ahead?
Keep taking notes.
Okay, I'm Saurabh Sinha. I have recently retired from the UN as I was the Chief of Social Policy in Africa, in Economic Commission for Africa. I'm currently the Senior Advisor at NCER. And I have a few observations and questions. And firstly, I'm quite impressed at how the situation in India mirrors the situation in Africa, if Africa is treated as a country. And the problems that are there are also here in terms of education and skills and the quality of labor that you are unable to hire. And I recall on the first day, Mr. Sharma talked about that if he wants to hire labor, he is not able to get them. So that is a huge constraint on that, which if it's combined with the reluctance for manufacturing jobs. Now, there is a preference for service sector jobs, and there's a very little preference for getting your hands dirty, so to say. That needs to be factored in as well in terms of scaling up. Because if there is a problem of getting labor, I might either be limited to less than 9, so that less hassles, less regulation, less problems, or I outsource the manufacturing. Or if I can get access to capital, then I go for importing machinery and get the work done and with much less labor. So those are the options in the current Indian context, which is what it is. The other thing I think which is happening now, and this is about the work done by John Page about industries without smokestacks. He's talking about Africa, but I mean, what I think is that we need to recognize here as well, if there is a reluctance to go into the manufacturing jobs, maybe we need to rethink the structure of the industry as well. Because even in India, I think the contribution of manufacturing to GDP is only about 10% or something, or 11%, which is very similar the case in Africa without it having gone up. Because that is roughly the rate in Western countries, West Europe, America, but after having dropped down from 17, 18, 20% at a higher level of GDP per capita. Here we are getting the same contribution of manufacturing to GDP at a lower level of GDP. So that is one of the other things that we need to. So we need to look at maybe ICT, maybe finance, maybe tourism, also need to be reclassified as industries rather than as services or something like that. We need to relook at how we structure in terms of our thinking on industry, because this is not going to change. The preference, the labor preference for not going, the labor's non-preference for manufacturing is extremely low. So that is one thing. And my last point really is about generally, again, relates to management of labor, and I'm sure it will echo with what Mr. Sharma was saying, that if you hire more labor, you are hiring problems. Partly that has been dealt with in a sense which has a negative impact, which is because of the decline in collective bargaining, for example. That keeps the wages low. And so if it keeps the wages low, then it's no longer attractive to go in for a job there. You might as well open your own sector, or you go into tourism or hospitality or something like that. So there is a kind of a circle which we need to break, and we need to think of interesting ways of doing that. Thank you.
Okay. We have quite a few. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. Sir, do we have any vision for a AI system in future so that we can have a extra high productive value, like China is very much active in AI. So what is our vision about AI?
Actually, I'm afraid you may have missed. There was an entire session yesterday devoted to AI. So that was the last person. There's a lady there. And after that, I'll give it back to the panelists.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir. I'm Jessica from the Reserve Bank. Thank you for those deep insights. I just wanted to comment, like you said, there is a problem in the way financing is required, and these companies don't get finances due to the small sizes. Do you think one reason, which you mentioned, the labor intensity, is one reason? Because these companies have an inherent nature of tapping personal funds and taking from relatives. So do you think they are hesitant to debt financing or equity financing? Or do they have more preference to debt, rather than diluting equity? I mean, you said you're seeing many sectors like toys, etc. Is it different for different sectors, or is it because they are labor intensive and tapping family funds? It is. There is also an companies have an aversion to giving them funds. I mean, what is the problem in the financing if they do equity financing or debt financing as such?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, let me start with you this time, Sanjay. You can, Sanjay, not say 3-4 minutes, not more than that. Which one is working? I don't know which one is working now. Just press it, maybe. Let's see if that's all. Oh. Now is it on? No? Yeah, it's come.
No, I won't take so much time. So let me start with Bangladesh and the textiles issue, because that is, textiles has been even in the olden time, it had a comparative advantage, and we continue to have that. Be it with the dyeing, be it with the, but of late, there is another segment which is coming up, and yesterday there was a full session on that, which is the man-made fibers. Of course, we are not as competitive on that, but slowly we are going into that, because the textile ministry is looking at the technical textile, the other man-made fibers very, very carefully. And I think it will be a time. Yesterday, I think there was some session where they talked about that the big manufacturers are not investing enough, but I would not really think of that, because everybody wants to make money, because tomorrow if the manufacturers are not able to produce the kind of things which is required in the market, their profits will go down, their sales will go down. So I would not buy that argument, because everybody is very, very rational, and But what India sells, and India sells in all the categories. India sells in the low category, India sells in the high product. What India also needs to, while it continues, it should continue in Tirupur and other places to continue to do those mass manufacturing with the other countries, with a kind of competition that Bangladesh of the world or Honduras of the world provide you. You need to do that, because you are a vast country, you have a large population, you have to have that, because it generates that kind of employment also. But at the same time, India has a great opportunity to also be in the product market, something which we have not done, and that is can be far bigger. What we have not done, and this is also a question, once I went to NIFT and I told them that you need to develop the new product, the products which are not only satisfying the Indian needs, but also thinking of international ones, the ones which has a larger market, the ones which has a better recovery, because you will be earning that amount of money, and you can do it much cheaper, because the question is, if we are not developing those kind of products, then obviously we'll only be a technology taker and will only be a manufacturer, will not be setting the trend. I mean, ultimately jeans was thought of by somebody at some point of time, and we are one of the foremost manufacturers of that, but we have not set that up. So what we need to put in our mind now is to also think of those aspects, and that this is talking about all. Now, here I also want to mention here that while we are talking about the global value chain, there is a domestic value chain also. This is not that the MSMEs will be left out in the whole thing. The products will come. The question is, how good is that product? How good, whether the price of this is competitive or not. And this is where the industry, as well as the government and the other societies, have to pay their attention to. How do we make our MSME? And here I'm not talking about only M, I'm actually emphasizing on S and other M, because they also have to move up. Somebody asked this question, why micro, and there are a large number of these manufacturers on the small enterprises, why they are not taking the finance? The reason is that their formality, their is not there. So they have to rely on the local finances rather than the institutional finance. So coming back to your question on the Bangladesh versus and textiles, I would say India will need to be on all the sectors and concentrate on the strategy where I should be there so that get more money, and money brings a better technology. It improves and because there is a kind of trickle down, and it does impact the other industries also. And to think that the technology we can keep them at the door, that's not going to happen. Once the technology has knocked, it will come inside. That's the nature of the technology. Willy-nilly, it has to be adopted, whether we do it now or whether we do. And the question is about the innovation, how well we are able to do that. That was one question. I don't recall the other ones, but
Okay, thanks.
when it comes to my mind, I can.
All right. Maybe I can request, is Mr. Bhardwaj still with us?
Oh, yes, I'm very much there. The only difficulty is that I would not be able to switch on the camera. So
Okay.
I think the answer to most of the questions that have been raised, I would say that we need to again go back to the basics. And that on the factor markets, whether it is access to the land, whether it is access to finance, whether it is access to raw material, leaving apart for the moment the skill part that most of the MSMEs and the other industries would be able to do, and they do themselves. But these three things, land, and out of the land also, even if you have a land, these two things, access to raw material and access to finance, continues to pose a serious problem because of lack of reforms. Let me quickly explain. If you take finance, for example, so in finance, 65 to 70% of the market is controlled by public sector banks. Public sector banks, as late Professor Vivek Debra used to say, of course, before becoming chief, say the chairman of the Prime Minister Council, that the Indian banks are, or public sector banks are, the largest monopoly in the world because they ultimately are reporting to one owner. And that has a huge impact on the competitiveness of the market, the way you serve the customer. You ask any MSME across the country, and they will tell you that how sordid and how difficult they find to deal with Indian banks. Secondly, with regard to the raw material, I also explained to you, and let me give an example in the case of textile and garments. Now, ultimately, you can divide this entire industry in two segments. One is man-made fiber and cotton. Now, cotton is the pricing in India continues to be, you can say, determined by the political, you can say, masters by the political masters, and it is very difficult for the cotton manufacturer, cotton garment manufacturer, textile manufacturers to take a long shot and enter into long-term agreements because they don't know when there would be a ban on the cotton exports, when they would allow it, and so on. On the man-made fiber, because India's largest manufacturer is a monopoly that controls almost 95% of manufacturing, it is almost impossible to import man-made fiber from abroad at competitive prices. So that means Indian garment manufacturers will have to continue to live with this short-term mentality. There is no other way out. I think unless we understand the complexity that is there within which we have to work as MSMEs, the simple solutions won't work. And lastly, I mean, this notion that, India has a huge market and, Indian MSMEs, like, for example, in garments would continue to serve, it's not going to the case. If you look at the large format stores today, whether it is a Walmart or whether it is the e-commerce platforms, you see that they are flooded with imported garments, which are almost 1/3 of the prices that could be produced, whether it is men's shirt, whether it is women blouses, and so on and so forth. So increasingly, steadily, they are being displaced by cheap imports. And it is a kind of, I say, secular decline of manufacturing, hollowing out of manufacturing is a serious matter, but no political party has guts to really take on these two matters, that is privatization of the bank and dealing with the monopolies of the raw material markets. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. This works. This one is working? Okay. Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bharat. That was very succinct and cogent observations. I'll now give the floor to Ravi. Ravi, maybe you want to. This is not working. So you want to use this or?
No, there's another one on that side.
There's one on your side also. But
Well, I think I agree to many of the points which Mr. Bharadwaj has made and the points which some of you have raised on the floor. I'm going to focus really on the issue of the the topic that we are discussing here. I think he's raised very relevant issues with respect to the disadvantages with the SMEs suffers from with respect to raw material, raw material prices, with respect to access to finance, with respect to real cost of finance, and so on. And these are real, these are very important issues. The only thing I want to highlight is that these issues actually grow as the size of the the size of the enterprise decreases. So the micro face these they face less issues with respect to issues like land and so on is less important for them, but certainly issues of finance, issues of technology, issues of cost of raw material, tariffs and so on are extremely important, and they face bigger problems even compared to the upper segment of this. And this is something which, the cost, Anant, I take your point that, the real cost of interest rates would have affected the manufacturing sector as a whole. But the fact is that the large within the manufacturing sector did always have access to diverse sources of finance. So the effective cost of finance for them is always much lower. And in fact, I don't know how significantly things have changed since we did our reports for the NCUS, but we showed systematically that large enterprises and large firms had access to public sector finance also. Public sector listing at rates of interest which were below PLR, whereas consistently micro enterprises, first of all, they had very limited access to finance, and secondly, these were at very high rates and typically much higher than the PLR at that point of time. So there is this question that we started out the reforms in the 90s by trying to provide a level playing field to large enterprises. To basically and to weed out inefficient enterprises and to improve efficiency. But the fact of the matter is that the way the entire policy regime and the thing has made is that the shoe, as it were, is on the other leg now. And we need to correct it if we want an environment in which, in general, MSMEs and labor-intensive industries can make a mark. That's the one point which I want to make. Secondly, this point that with respect to it was made with respect to Bangladesh, and you, Sanjay, also answered this whole thing. How exactly within apparel wear, for example, how exactly do Indian firms move up the value chain? How do they capture greater value? Now, this can be done at different levels in different ways. For example, at the lowest level also, it can be done through institutional innovation. Cooperatives is very clearly forming cooperatives, forming federations, and so on. So it can be done at the lowest level. At the highest level, it can also be done, and it needs to be done in garments. You have to move up the value chain. But if Indian firms, and this is increasingly the case, by the way, in garment, which point has been made, that we are turning into a global marketplace. Indian brands have steadily been eroded, and foreign brands have steadily taken over the Indian market. The manufacturing is being done in India by small enterprises, by medium enterprises, and so on, at much smaller markups. So basically, more and more manufacturing is being done at these very thin margins, rather than Indian firms being able to build up Indian brands and being able to scale up production and move up the value chain. So this is a point of concern, and this is a general point of concern. I'm giving apparel as an example, but this is also a point of concern when it comes to manufacture of other goods. That instead of developing our own products and moving up the value chain, we become just a global, producer of goods at thin margins, that we're not able to develop an ecosystem where labor-intensive manufacturing takes place. So that is, I think, is a big issue. I agree with Ashwini. Labor is land is of course a location-specific issue. So there can be scarcity of land in some places as opposed to other places, and so on. One has to look at that carefully. Land banks have been created, and there is enough land available in general. On labor, I tend to completely agree with you. I think our objective is not just employment; it is actually to create decent employment. Within this whole problem of labor intensity, we can't have something which is a race to the bottom. In many of these labor-intensive industries, garments, for example, actually the cost of labor is just 5 to 7% of markup value. It's not huge at all, and this is true for many industries. And what is driven to the bottom is really labor costs, because input costs are taken as given. They are either imported or they are otherwise taken as given. So what can be driven down is labor cost. So what is seen to be that it can be driven down is the only variable cost that is seen to be truly flexible is labor. And that is something we need to carefully look at, because labor intensity in general is an abstract concept, but within that we also want to look at decent work.
Well, thank you. And let me first of all, thank everybody for very insightful thing. Most points which people raised have been covered, but if some have not, please feel free to take it up over that. I'll just add one. There was a comment right at the beginning about ONDC, which didn't seem to get addressed. I should make a small observation. Things like ONDC, etc., are very difficult to assess, and the horizon is very short. This thing was started only a few years back. One way to look at what sort of time horizons we should be looking at is to look at the payment systems thing. Payment system modernization and setting up UPI was done by RBI and the National Payment Corporation of India Limited from the early 2000 onwards. Somewhere around 2003-4, they had set it up and it started building up. It took almost 15 years for it to achieve scale, because network industries grow in a very different manner. They grow in an exponential manner, but the early years tend to be slow. So give it time. I suspect you will see a lot of things happening there. The larger question which Nitya raised and Ravi added to in some way is moving up the value chain and developing, if you like, Indian brands. That's a bigger challenge, and that requires something very important. It is that while certainly you should support small, but you should not denigrate the big. I think Deng Xiaoping had said to be rich is good. And India still has that hang up that somehow to be successful is wrong. Somebody must have done something wrong if he's successful. I think we need to give that up. Success should be rewarded and success should be encouraged. I'll give you one example and we'll close this conversation at that point. China built up its brands by nurturing them. There is one major example, Lenovo, which literally bought out a brand from IBM. And today it's identified with the ThinkPad was an IBM product, is now part of the Lenovo stable. Lenovo has expanded the ThinkPad framework and developed many others. Brands need not be where they are today. We should not be averse to being open-minded about it, and if need be, either through acquisition or through development of our own, think about ways of moving up the value chain. I think it's time we should start thinking that Jaguar is an Indian company. Yes.
On behalf of ISID, I thank you, Professor Anand, Professor Ravi Srivastava, Mr. Sanjay Kumar, and a special thank you to Mr. Anil Bharadwaj for joining us online. And thank you, participants in the session, for adding to the discussions with your comments and questions. At the close of the session, I request my colleague, Dr. Ajit Jha, to present a small token of our gratitude to the chair and to the speakers. I request Professor Nagesh Kumar to join us on the stage for a group photograph. Please step forward. Thank you. Would like to tell all of you that the technical sessions should start at 2. We will try our best to start the technical sessions at 2, and lunch is in the C1 hall. So please join us for lunch. Thank you so much. Here for the valedictory session. Thank you. The technical sessions are 2 on the ground floor of the main hall. 1 Next question.